Here's what's coming today on the Woodworking Network podcast.
And he said, well, Doug, I don't know why you would be studying to be a lawyer when your brains are in your hands.
Welcome to this episode of the Woodworking Network podcast. Join us as we explore the business of woodworking, big and small, and what it takes to succeed. I'm Will Sampson. Today's episode is sponsored by WoodPro Expo California. We'll be talking with woodworker and educator Doug Stowe about his thoughtful new book, The Wisdom of Our Hands. But first, I want to talk about maker or thinker. There's been a lot of attention paid to what's been called the maker movement. It's a trend for people making things themselves rather than just buying something off the shelf. But it also is related to do-it-yourself home improvements and even hackers who take already existing things, reimagine them, and re-engineer them to create something else. I've been a maker since my first primitive efforts as a child. My father was not naturally handy, but I loved working with him on small craft projects like assembling an electric train set, painting bookshelves, or doing some scouting craft. He was not a woodworker, and there was no shop or extensive collection of tools in the house. His primary tools were in his head, and mostly came out as facts and figures on paper. He was a business executive for several major corporations before cancer took him when I was just 9 years old. Consequently, I've grown up with both those maker and business thinker traits combined. I started 2 businesses that paid my way through college, and one was a small manufacturing operation. But my college degree in journalism had more to do with thinking and analyzing than making. Still, my business, woodworking, and metalworking activities have always given me a focus on people who make a life making things. I also love teaching people to make things and watch the glow of accomplishment in their faces when they succeed. I think we've let too many people bypass that joy of making things. We've dismissed the thinking component of making to our own detriment. If you make, you have to think. But some thinkers never make anything physical. Maybe we'd all be better off if the thinkers learned to make something too. Before we get to our interview with Doug Stowe, let's pause for a word from our sponsor. It's really easy for woodworkers to stay stuck inside, focused on their shops and production. But over the last couple of years, the pandemic has forced them to be even more isolated than usual. Now it's time to get out of the shop and resume life in the outside world, especially when it's a chance to network with your woodworking business peers. That opportunity is coming April 27th, 29th in sunny San Diego as the WoodPro Expo joins with Closets Conference and Expo to offer an unparalleled opportunity to boost your business with intelligence on techniques, tools, and technology. Let's get face-to-face again. Learn more at woodproexpocalifornia.com. See you there. Now let's talk about the wisdom of our hands with Doug Stowe. Today our guest is Doug Stowe, author of a new book titled The Wisdom of Our Hands. Doug is a longtime woodworker, well known for his intricately inlaid boxes, and he's also an educator. Welcome to the Woodworking Network podcast, Doug.
Well, thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be interesting. I thoroughly enjoyed your book. Some of the connections you make in the book between manual training and how we learn. But tell us first, how did the book come about?
Well, many years ago, I was at the edge of dropping out of college. I'd gone home to tell my parents that I didn't have any intention of returning for the final semester. I was in my senior year. And my parents had this idea that I was to become a lawyer because my grandfather was and my great-grandfather, they were both lawyers. So something about family tradition and all that stuff. And I was just disgusted with myself and with college and the abstractness of it. And I so on the way to my parents' house, I stopped to see a friend of mine who had helped me restore an antique Ford. And he said, "Well, Doug, I don't know why you would be studying to be a lawyer when your brains are in your hands." And so that came as a complete shock to me that I thought the brains were one thing and the hands were something else. And so I went back to school and I managed to squeak by, courtesy of I think professors who took pity on me. And I took a class in pottery and a class in creative writing, and I just decided I was going to make some fun of it, and which I did, and I ended up graduating. But then when I was out of school, wondering, well, what am I going to do with myself? I thought woodworking. My father had bought a shopsmith for me when I was 14 years old, so. That was it, and I were the same age, 1948 models, and so I thought that would be a pretty cool thing, and so shaggy dog stories, they take a little while to get to the point. Later on, I started really thinking about. I was inspired by James Krenov, as many people were. He talked about woodworking in a way that helped you to know there's more about it. It was less about sticking part A on part B than it was about shaping your own mind and the way you thought about things. And so I made a lot of boxes. I made little boxes because I was living in a small town where I live now, Eureka Springs, Arkansas. It's a tourist town, and so what are tourists going to carry home? Little knickknacks and boxes, and so I made a lot of boxes, and along the way, it caught the attention. My inlaid boxes caught the attention of a publisher. It was a guy by the name of David Lewis from F&W Publications, and that's an umbrella company that at that time owned Popular Woodworking Magazine and Woodworkers Book Club, and they'd had a focus group, and the focus group said, well, inlay might be a real hot subject and boxes might be a real hot subject. And so he saw my inlaid boxes and said, I'm going to ask this guy to write a book.
Get all of it in one book.
Yeah. And so I told David, I said, I'm not really interested in writing a how-to book. I'd rather write a why-to book. I'm really inspired by the writings of James Krenov, and I'd like to pick up the dialogue where he left off. And David said, well, if you can give me 16 projects, I'll give you a sidebar in each chapter where you can talk about philosophy to your heart's content. And so it turned out to be a good formula. And then it still, was all these years since that guy told me my brains were in my hands. I was still thinking about it, and I was thinking that it was obviously true for me. And I was observing how my hands brought about some clarity to what I was thinking. And so I, after being a little bit successful in publishing, I thought, well, I'll get into teaching. And so I did at Clear Spring School. I taught a little bit of adult education stuff. I taught for some woodworking clubs, and I taught at Aramont and other craft schools. And so I started the Wisdom of the Hands woodworking program at Clear Spring School to try to develop this idea that I was thinking about, how the brains and the hands are integrally a part of each other. And I had also had this idea that I wasn't alone in having my brains and my hands connected. I decided that it was probably something that was true for everyone.
Well, that's real interesting. You talk in the book. You frequently mentioned the educational sloyd. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that correctly.
Yes, you are.
Can you explain what that is and the history behind it? Because it kind of runs parallel to some of the things that you're talking about.
Well, educational Sloyd was a system of woodworking education that started in Finland and Sweden. And it really originated with a guy by the name of Uno Signaeus. And Uno Signaeus had been challenged by the Russian Tsar, who was in control of Finland at that time, to develop a system of folk schools. And so Signaeus had looked all over Europe trying to figure out what would be the best model to use. And at that time, Friedrich Froebel's kindergarten had been developed but outlawed by the German government. And Signaeus decided that was the ideal method to introduce to the folk schools because it involved play and it involved sequential growth and a holistic viewpoint. And so the kindergarten at that time only went up until you're 8 years old. And so he decided he had to have something that would go beyond that. And he decided that crafts were the ideal way to extend the kindergarten style of learning into the upper grades. And at the same time, shortly thereafter, Otto Salomon in Sweden was captured by the same idea for many of the same reasons. And so kindergarten and educational Sloyd grew up almost together as a movement. And so it was a system. I first learned about educational Sloyd when I was visiting at North Bennett Street School, which was one of the places in the United States where educational Sloyd was first introduced.
North Bennett Street is actually the very first trade school in the United States.
And so it was actually, North Bennett Street School has a very complex but very interesting relationship with manual arts training in the United States. But when I was at North Bennett Street School, I was explaining my program that I was establishing at Clear Spring School, and they said, "Oh, you mean Sloyd?" And I'd never heard Sloyd except for Sloyd knives were sold in the woodcraft catalog at that time, and you didn't know why it was called a Sloyd knife. But it was a program of woodworking education that recognized that woodworking education was about a lot more than just filling jobs in industry. It recognized that when you make something, you're not just making something, you are in fact making yourself. You are developing your skills, which gives you higher value, not only as economic value, but higher value within society, a higher point of reference for who you are. I make something in the shop, and I'll take it in put it on the kitchen counter so my wife can see if it's small enough, because I want others to recognize something that I've accomplished. One of the things I mentioned in the book is islands of competence. And as you develop, you are then inclined to go to the next level, and then from there to the next level, and from there to the next level. But it's intrinsic. It's not something that someone has told you have to do. It's something that excites you on the inside. And that is really what I think the model of education should be, and very much based on what Friedrich Froebel was developing in kindergarten, and then what Uno Signaeus was developing in educational Sloyd.
Well, if you aren't excited about what you're learning, you're not going to continue in any other learning adventures, and you're not going to expand what you're learning.
My mother was a kindergarten teacher, so she would, when parents would come for conferences, she would say, when your child comes home from school and you've asked your child, what did they do today? And they say, play, you should know that they're giving you the right answer. because learning is actually fun.
Well, if we make it fun, it can.
It can be fun.
Yeah.
You ran the piece about Gary Knox Bennett, and I think he's a good example of someone who took his education, as limited as it was, and built something from it because he was having a damn good time.
Oh yeah. 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 Lots of fun and a great sense of humor.
Great sense of humor.
Yeah. Well, I thought the discussion in your book about Scandinavian manual training and manual education was fascinating. Um, I think a lot of people think that Europe is way ahead of us in manual training, but they're thinking about apprenticeships and training for the trades, and that
Mhm.
hasn't always been the case. I have a good friend in Sweden who actually founded a private trade school decades ago there because there wasn't enough public education for the trades there. So it's,
Mhm.
all education is always in flux, no matter what.
Yeah.
But
Thank you.
the thing that I really liked about your book too is kind of the things that you've touched on of the benefits that you see of early manual education or even adult manual education that go beyond training for the trades.
Yeah. The there's a wonderful essay by a guy by the name of David Henry Feldman, and he talks about the child as craftsman. And in his essay, "The Child as Craftsman," he points out that, and David Henry Feldman was someone who really worked with the gifted and talented children, and a study of the one things that made them gifted and made them talented. And yet it doesn't only apply to them, but that every child has an inclination to try to want to get better at something, to get to a point where others recognize that the child has unique values, unique abilities. And so they instead of everybody wanting to do the same thing, they want to do different things. And even within a family, I know my sister was really involved in becoming an artist. And so I for a long time chose a different path. I was to become the academic, which was why my parents thought I should become a lawyer. But we need to have education in which, instead of everybody becoming alike, coming out of an assembly line, we're all encouraged to become different and to find our own spark that will carry us into whatever life presents.
One of the quotes from the book that stands out a lot is even poorly executed handwork teaches lessons to the learner, not the least of which is to value well executed work. I've always thought that people trying to do woodwork are much more appreciative of fine woodworking, no matter how successful their own woodworking efforts are. And I think part of the problem that we've had in the business side of woodworking in convincing people to value high quality woodworking is that the average person that is a consumer of woodworking has no perception of what's involved in the process.
I, I I think that's exactly right. They don't, and one of the things I mentioned in the book is that many of the people who have been encouraging of me in my work, I can trace back to them having had some experience related to what I do. Or, for example, one friend of mine is a wood sculptor, and she commissioned me over a period of years to build a number of pieces for their home. Um, a very close friend of mine who had me build a number of pieces for their home has an art degree from Syracuse, master's in fine arts, and along the way has become a wood sculptor. And so people who have a sense of what it takes to create something also have a sense of why they should support the creativity of others.
Well, I think there's something too that you get out of learning that you can make things, that you don't have to buy things, everything, or get someone else to buy it for you. I have no idea if it was connected to the educational Sloyd movement or anything, but I had the privilege of being, when I was in first grade in an elementary school in Southern California. Um, there was a thing that was going on there where they equipped the first grade classrooms with woodworking hand tools and had
Oh,
integrated that into the curriculum. So like we were, studying transportation, and we'd take two boards and nail them crosswise, and that's an airplane, and whatever. It was all very simple, very primitive,
yeah,
but you learned about measuring things, you learned about putting things together, and you sometimes tried things that were too difficult or whatever. But it was sort of bringing the classroom talk about airplanes and trucks and trains and boats
hmm,
and putting it through your hands.
yeah. I've had students that would go with their parents to Walmart and walk through the toy section, and my student would tell his mother, I could make that. Where did you go to school, and what city were you in
I
California?
was I was in Sherman Oaks, California, but that particular school was Roscommare Road Elementary School,
Oh,
and I talked years later to uh, a vocational ed teacher in the LA school system, and I just asked him, did you ever hear that? Was that something that was just in that school or whatever? He said it was pretty much district wide for a number of years, but it probably got cut in some budget cut, or
yeah,
somebody hurt themselves and they decided the insurance load was too much, or what. It was just, there was no special teacher, it was the classroom teacher who was
yeah.
leading things. And it was,
Well, that sounds
but
very much like educational Sloyd, because Otto Salomon believed that teachers made the best teachers of woodworking rather than craftsmen making the best teachers, because the teachers would have a sense of the developmental needs of the child. And there was a big movement of educational Sloyd in California. Uh, Edna Ann Rich was one of the leaders, and she wrote a book called Paper Sloyd, which many of your readers might be interested in, uh, because it was a precursor to working with wood. It would have been for kindergarten age kids and maybe for first grade, where you take paper and fold it. So it wasn't origami where you're making decorative things. You were making practical things like boxes and pinwheels and things like that. Scissor holders,
yep,
beautiful little things made of
paper
folded paper.
chains.
Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I remember doing some of that too.
isn't it
So,
funny how the things that you actually did are so much more memorable than the things that you may have read?
well, I think there's something too about the sense of accomplishment. For a couple of summers, I taught a kids woodworking class that was like a week long program that I developed there. I had the kids for like 4 hours a day for 5 days, and
Uh-huh.
and it was a combined class that had kids from uh, I think it was first through fourth grades,
Uh-huh.
and both boys and girls. And almost none of the kids had any experience working with tools or anything.
Hmm.
And I know that some parents and some of the school people were terrified that some kid was going to hurt himself. But we didn't have any injuries, and the kids went home with a finished project every day, uh,
Yeah.
and they were really excited. And then on the last day of the class, the project was to make a little tool tote, and
Oh,
I sent them home with that and a list of all the tools that they had used in the class and urged the parents to fill the tool tote.
That's similar to a project we did during the pandemic. I was concerned that the kids didn't have tools at home, and so over Zoom we made toolboxes, and when they would come on campus, I would supply some of the tools that they needed to go in there, like small hammers and
Right.
you know, it's interesting. The kids absolutely love it. They, the moment they walk in. So I have my woodworking program at Clear Spring School, and um, the kids know immediately when they walked into the shop that there's something different about this place. It may be the mess that I've left on the floor preparing materials for them, but it's also the smell of the place. The aroma of the sawdust, and there's something about the engagement of all the senses, each and every one of our senses helps us to understand what's really real.
A lot better than just buying it off the shelf.
A lot better than buying it off the shelf. And it's funny, modern manufacturing makes everything just spitting image perfect. And if it's a cereal box that has a little crimple in the corner, you may take the one from behind it, because we're so obsessed with this thing of being perfect. But when it comes to kids' works or our work as grown-ups, we take great pride in things, even when they're not absolutely perfect.
Absolutely. That's there was supposedly a California Indian tribe, the Pomo Indians, who were well known for their baskets, and they supposedly left purposely a flaw, at least one flaw in every basket, so the demons could escape the basket.
I've heard similar things about the Amish leaving one stitch undone rather than compete with the perfection of
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think I've heard of a similar tradition in Japan. But you can have incredible craftsmanship, as you know from many of the people you've written about or talked to or supported in their work. You can have incredible craftsmanship that may seem almost miraculous to some people who are just starting out. But I remember as an early subscriber to Fine Woodworking, I was always just absolutely in awe of the things that I would see in there, and then wondered what in the world would I have to do to reach a level in which I could be in the magazine. And then finally I was in the magazine, but it wasn't, you don't have to be perfect at everything. All you have to do is have a few good ideas and work your butt off, right?
You just have to get started.
And you have to get started.
I think that's what's great about your book is that it talks about introducing manual training and using your hands to everybody, regardless of where you think they're eventually going to wind up, and that it becomes just a life component. I think that's just a wonderful thing. I think a lot of our educators would do well to re-examine that value.
It could be as important to be able to make, could become as important to us as the ability to read.
That's a great thought.
And the benefits of that is that we would become so much more appreciative of each other. We would, instead of feeling superior to the plumber who fixes the problem that we caused by trying to flush too much down, he might come in, or she might come in, and we would feel a sense of reverence and awe for that person, for their abilities, rather than being disparaging of them.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's been a lot of, particularly in the public schools, of trying to discourage people from going into trades and handwork and things like that.
Yeah.
And people like Mike Rowe have tried to turn that around. And
Yes.
I think that's an important part, and I think that's something that comes out of your book too. But the thing that I don't want to give people the wrong impression: the book is not about training people for trades. It's about the
No.
value of just learning through your hands. Like you said at the beginning, that your brain was in your hands. Well, I think a lot of people might find that their brain is in their hands too, if they just gave it a chance.
Even people who have academic aspirations, benefit from doing things that are real. You can go way off in the deep. You can go way off a deep end in whatever you want to think or propose. You can make stuff up, and people make stuff up all the time. And it's good to really test everything in physical life. Now, so for example, someone wants to be a historian. It would kind of help them to understand the tools of architecture, for example. It would help to put things in context. It would help them to dig ditches if they want to know what it was like at Gettysburg. It would help them to knap flint if they want to know something about the American Indian or other indigenous tribes. It makes things richer and deeper. And in that depth, you find more excitement, to have done something that's real. And so it's not just. So an example, I have a friend whose son had gone off to become a nuclear physicist, working at the big collider someplace. I think he was at Argonne National Labs. And they got to a point where their research project was shut down because they had to wait for the people to come, the technicians to come in to solve this particular physical problem. And so my friend's son went to the Ace Hardware store, bought everything he needed, and had it working the next day. And there are all kinds of examples like that of people who knew how to do things that then would transform everything. There was one guy who was working on the big oil spill down in the Gulf, that was so catastrophic, and they were trying to figure out how to cap the well. And he's a guy from the thinking place at MIT. And he left the meeting without talking to anybody, went home and devised the thing and had it delivered while they were still talking about it. That's what the hands do.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, the book is called The Wisdom of Our Hands. It's available through Amazon and most book outlets, and it's by Doug Stowe. And thank you, Doug, for spending some time with us today. This has been
welcome.
Really great. And now I want to get back and do something with my hands. That's it for today. If you're looking for more of our podcasts, you can find all of them at woodworkingnetwork.com/podcasts and in popular podcast channels. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single episode. Thanks again to today's sponsor, Wood Pro Expo. If you have a comment or topic you'd like us to explore, contact me at will.sampson@woodworkingnetwork.com. Thanks for listening.